Today, we're jumping into something really fascinating, the ancient feasts of Israel. And these were so much more than just holidays or big parties. They were actually a kind of divine curriculum designed by God himself to shape the very heart and mind of his people. Let's see how he did it.
So let's start with a really practical question. Can you imagine this? 3 times every single year, every man in Israel had to just drop everything. His job, his family, his whole routine, and travel, sometimes for days, all the way to Jerusalem. This wasn't just a good idea. It was a command from God. So you have to ask, why? Why build such a demanding rhythm into the very fabric of their lives?
Well, it's because this was all about formation, not just celebration. These weren't just items on a festival calendar. God was using these required gatherings to intentionally mold the nation's identity, to shape their collective memory, and to form their entire worldview. He was teaching them, step by step, who he was and who they were because of him. Now, at the very heart of this divine curriculum were 3 mandatory pilgrimage seasons. Israel had a bunch of different feasts, sure, but these 3, well, these were the non-negotiable pillars of their entire year of worship.
Okay, so what were they? First up, in the spring, you had Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Then came the Feast of Weeks, which was all about celebrating the harvest. And finally, in the fall, you had the Feast of Tabernacles. Each one taught its own absolutely vital lesson.
So let's start right at the foundation. The very first lesson was all about remembering their past, specifically how they even became a people in the first place. And this, of course, was the powerful lesson of Passover. And just look at the raw, humbling reality of what they were told to remember. This isn't some glorious story of a military victory they achieved. No, they were commanded to remember Egypt, to remember being slaves, to remember being utterly helpless. They had to recall the terror of God's judgment passing over, and then the miracle of the lamb, the blood on the doorposts, and that impossible rescue. This is the message God was basically drilling into their hearts year after year after year. Every Passover meal was like a direct declaration from God saying, you did not free yourselves. You are not some self-made nation. The only reason you even exist as a free people is because I stepped in. I brought you out. And that was the fundamental lesson. Their whole identity as a nation wasn't supposed to be rooted in their own strength or their wisdom or how good they were. Nope. It was to be rooted in a single, unearned act of divine deliverance. Their starting point was always, always grace. But that foundation of past rescue, that was only the beginning. Next, God moves their attention from the past right into their present reality. And he does this through the lesson of the Feast of Weeks, the harvest festival. Now, this wasn't just some quaint religious ceremony. This was about survival. This feast showed them just how profoundly vulnerable they were. I mean, their entire existence was tied to this incredibly simple, fragile cycle. If God didn't send the rain, there was no harvest. And if there was no harvest, there was no food. And no food meant no life. It was really that simple and honestly, that terrifying. The lesson of this second feast was just unmistakable. God was saying, hey, your dependence on me didn't end back at the Red Sea. Yes, you needed me to rescue you then, but you also need me for your very next meal. God was teaching them that his grace wasn't just a historical event. It was a daily, moment-by-moment, life-sustaining reality. Okay, so now we come to the final set of feasts in the fall. And here, the focus makes this huge, dramatic shift. The lesson isn't just about what God has done for them anymore, or even how he provides for them. It becomes about how they must live before him. And this brings up a brand new, really searching question that frames these final feasts. It's one thing to worship a distant God who rescues and provides. It's a whole other thing to live with that holy God dwelling right there in your midst. What kind of life does that demand? And just notice the stark contrast in the tone here. The earlier feasts, they were mostly joyful celebrations of what God had done. But the final feast season, it doesn't begin with a party. It begins with a solemn confrontation. It's this big shift from remembering to responding. Before that final celebration could even begin, the entire nation had to stop for the Day of Atonement. This was a day of fasting, of affliction, a national reckoning. Why? Because if a holy God was going to live among them, their sin was a massive problem that had to be addressed. It couldn't just be ignored or swept under the rug. It all led to this unavoidable truth. The very presence of God among his people raised the stakes. His holiness right there in their midst demanded a response to their unholiness. Sin had to be confronted, it had to be confessed, and it had to be atoned for. God could dwell with them, yes, but not without cleansing. So it was only after that solemn, serious work of atonement was complete that the joyful Feast of Tabernacles could begin. And this casts the whole feast in a new light, doesn't it? It wasn't just a history lesson about the wilderness. It was a celebration of what was now possible, living in the presence of a holy God as a forgiven, cleansed people. And by living in those temporary booths, they were reminded one last time that their ultimate security wasn't in their houses or their land, but in God alone. So, when you kind of zoom out and you look at the whole picture, you can see how these three distinct lessons all weave together into one complete, powerful message that was taught year after year after year. It's like a progressive lesson plan for the whole year. Passover declared, "I brought you out." That's the message of redemption. The Feast of Weeks declared, "I sustain you." That's the message of dependence. And then Tabernacles, coming right after Atonement, declared, "Okay, now live rightly before me, because I dwell among you." And that's the message of holiness. Redemption, dependence, and holiness. And this brings us to the ultimate takeaway from all of this. God's rescue from Egypt was never meant to be the final goal. It wasn't the finish line. Nope. It was the starting line. It was the gracious act that made a whole new kind of life possible, a life of communion and obedience, lived in the very presence of God himself. But, and this is so important, embedded within this beautiful curriculum was also a really stark and urgent warning. Forgetting these lessons wasn't just a minor slip-up. It was profoundly dangerous. See, if they forgot that their entire existence was based on God's rescue and sustained by his provision, they might start to put their security in all the wrong things. They might start to believe they were secure just because they possessed the promised land, or that they were safe just because God's temple stood in Jerusalem. They would start to trust the gifts instead of the giver. These feasts were like a yearly reset button, constantly reminding them of this core truth. Their security, their prosperity, their very life as a nation did not depend on geography or buildings. It depended entirely on their relationship with the living God who had redeemed them, sustained them, and called them to be holy. As so we end where that final feast leaves us, with this searching question. These feasts were more than rituals. They were God's answer. They taught Israel that the only appropriate response to a God who redeems and sustains and dwells with his people is a life of humble remembrance, grateful dependence, and intentional holiness. And it's a question that really echoes down through the centuries, challenging us even today.